So just to warn you guys, this is a 300 level session on kind of the app model for SharePoint. We're going to talk about some advanced patterns, but I would say it focuses a little bit more on the developer side. I think there might be some things in there for the IT pro, but just to set expectations that we are talking about some development patterns. So it's going to be about, I would say, 70% demonstration and probably about 30% slides. So we should, not going to be, we'll look at some code, but we're not going to sit here and code you to death. So. And
we're really looking at kind of decisions that we made on building this application and what the kind of user experience was like. So how did that interact? What were the decisions that we did in the framework?
So we'll go ahead and kick off. My name is Richard DeZerga. I am based out of Texas in the States, and I have with me
Nathan Miller, and I'm also with Microsoft out of Texas.
So today we're going to talk about advanced patterns in cloud-hosted apps for SharePoint. So just out of curiosity, did anyone go to some of the introductory sessions on apps for SharePoint? So Nathan and Israel had one, and then there was one yesterday around some of the tooling. A few people went? Okay, great. So this is a kind of a natural progression to some of those. This is definitely on when I say cloud-hosted, so we're talking about things that are running in a cloud. Could be Azure, it could be your own private cloud on-premise somewhere. It could be, who knows, Amazon for all we care. But we really want to kind of hopefully...
We actually care, it's just...
yeah, that's true.
But it could be Amazon.
We are talking about doing things server-side, whereas like the SharePoint-hosted apps, they are all client-side technologies. We're going to have a mixture of both. So in terms of session objectives, we want to talk about some of the complex challenges of delivering cloud-hosted apps. We want to demonstrate some of those advanced patterns and practices for the new app model. And one of the kind of key things we wanted to do was illustrate a solution that leverages really the full breadth of the new app model. So we're actually going to dovetail in a lot of the Office apps in this as well. So there's some really powerful things you can do when you combine the two different app models together. It's really one app model, but we target different platforms versus Office versus SharePoint. So we're going to do really this entire hour and 15 minutes around one big solution. I would say it's probably the most complex, advanced cloud-hosted app for SharePoint that's out there, right? Actually, it's not really out there, but that's been developed. This is something that the product group reached out to Nathan and I on trying to develop some better examples that we can show customers around the SharePoint app model. So we're going to introduce you to, actually before we do that, we do have giveaways. So if you were at Nathan's session earlier this week, you saw he gave out a bind tuning theme, and we have another one to give out during this. So based upon maybe some good questions, we will give you guys a chance to get a free bind tuning theme. And the cool thing about these is it's about a $400 US dollar value, and it's pretty amazing. We actually have a colleague that saw this and was like, I just spent like $1,000 building a brand. And so this is a pretty neat thing that we'll be able to give you guys. One person. All right. Wow, this slide keeps wanting to go forward. I don't know why. But this is what we're going to kind of center the discussion around, is a solution called Help Desk. The concept behind Help Desk, if anyone remember the Fab 40 templates back in SharePoint 2007? I see a couple nods and smiles. So the Fab 40 templates was a set of templates that we gave customers. It was out that you could download and install on your farm, and it gave you the ability to do some things in SharePoint. It was kind of like a composite solution and built into a template that delivered different capabilities. The most popular of the Fab 40 was a help desk. So Nathan and I, who work with customers on a daily basis, we run into customers at least a couple times a year that are still kind of locked into the Fab 40 templates because they've built a solution, or they've leveraged that help desk template for their needs. A few kind of caveats about our solution. I'll tell you that Nathan and I are in no interest in trying to sell this in the store. I don't want to be the help desk for the help desk, if that makes any sense. But what we would like to do is hopefully make the entire solution available to where you can go download the code and be able to see the patterns that we did. That being said, anything that we develop at Microsoft and try to provide to the community does need to go through legal review. So we're kind of in the process of trying to do some of that now. So if you have questions on, hey, can we get the solution? I hope so in the near future. It's not there today. So with that, let's jump into some of the considerations around this.
So I guess the first thing that we had to look at is what type of application we're going to build. When we look at the different application models, we talked about kind of the auto-hosting and how that tendency works. In this case, we just didn't really have great examples of how would you build multi-tenant models if you were actually doing a server set on-premise, or if you were doing a server set in the cloud, but you had multiple customers that needed to access that information. So maybe in an extranet scenario, or even a department-level scenario, how do we actually want to manage tenancy? So when we started deciding on how we would actually go through and decide that, we needed to look at what was the easiest way to separate the data, but we also had to look at a cost model. So originally we thought, well, maybe the best way to separate data would have actually been to provision a new database with each tenant having their own database. But when you actually calculate the costs on that, it doesn't necessarily make sense. So what we decided to do was actually use it in a model and then have our services actually determine the tenant and actually do the filtering off of the different data sets. So we had to kind of go through what are we going to do from a shared standpoint, what are we going to do from a security standpoint. And it really comes down to kind of the cost versus the security that you need to do for your application. The other thing that we did is we actually decided that we're going to use basically one web app. We made a decision that we were going to have the Office apps run as a separate web app and then have the shared database and maybe some of the shared services. It just, when we got to deployment, it made it too complex, especially when we were looking at QA, staging, production, and then 2 production areas. When we actually had 2 web apps that we had to deploy for each one, you end up multiplying your deployments. So it became very hard to kind of manage the keys and manage the deployments. And it made a lot of sense to just roll those apps into the one big web app solution. So I'm going to go through kind of our solution package itself and how we're actually doing some of the tenancy stuff. Switch me over. So first off, if you saw our earlier sessions, this is actually a provider-based application. So you see it's provider-hosted. And again, that means that we've got a SharePoint solution, but we also have a full .NET solution running on a server somewhere else. In our case, we're actually using the new Azure Web Sites capability with SQL Azure behind the scenes as well. So a couple of things to note in here is we do have a lot of hooks into SharePoint. So it is a SharePoint app. It's running as a full .NET app that we've got a custom brand on, and Rich will talk more about that. But we need permissions because we're actually making calls into SharePoint. So the calls that we're making in SharePoint, we're using search. We're also using the user profile, and you'll see how we're actually pulling that up and querying off people's profiles to assign engineers to tickets and to assign people opening tickets. We want to get as much information about them as possible. If we know who the user is and we know what department they report to, let's actually capture that information and not have to have them enter in information if we know that already. So SharePoint is very good at that. We also are using some things on taxonomy. So we have a corporate taxonomy. We can actually use and query that and use that in the ticket system. And then also the actual tenant itself. In this case, we've got a 365 SharePoint tenant, and we're doing a write because we're actually doing posts to our news feed for different things whenever we do a ticket close and certain ticket updates. We want to actually make it very aware for the users so they don't have to go back into the app and keep checking their current status of their ticket. All right, so when I look at the application, a couple things to point out here. So I've got my database. One of the things that we had to do is basically go in and on the app event receiver, the app itself has handle app install. So we talked about in a lot of our other sessions that when you look at the applications, if you have to do special things during an install or uninstall, you actually do that through an app event. So what ends up happening on a SharePoint app is when you wire up the app event, it automatically creates a web service for you. and actually puts the hooks in there so that whenever your app gets installed, it calls the web service. And so in that case, what we're doing is seeing if this tenant has ever registered this application before. And then the current user that is installing this application will become the main admin for the application itself. So the first time it gets installed in the tenant, the first time it's installed by an admin, then we'll actually make that the admin to start being able to do additional security on other users and other engineers.
So just as a recap, so far we're again, everything is being segregated in the database by tenant ID, and then we're going to capture that tenant ID when the app is first installed by the user here.
So a couple things to note is let me go ahead and I kick this off to actually show you kind of the debugging of that. So when you debug this, you have two options. When you have an app install, you have to debug on install. So if you want to actually do that, what ends up happening behind the scenes is on Service Bus, we can actually make a hook in there and actually do the debugging on there. So there's a setup in Visual Studio to do this type of debugging. And then it's very helpful, though. We didn't have this initially, but it's very helpful to step through on an install or uninstall. Those are very difficult events to kind of capture. Something might have gone wrong, especially in this case where we're actually provisioning data for this service.
And I think this is, I come from a development background, and I've spent a lot of time in the SharePoint space doing development. And I think sometimes Nathan and I take for granted other SharePoint developers' exposure to things like Azure. So just for those that aren't familiar with Azure, and more specifically the Service Bus within Azure, ultimately what's happening here is by registering a Service Bus within Azure, we can have the cloud call a local host service without having to have a static IP, without having to do anything, have like an actual address. It can just hit a local host service, and that's what's happening here. So when he's debugging, by having that Azure Service Bus set up, that web service that's basically his app installed event will actually be able to be called out from the cloud, and that's exactly what's happening here.
Go in here. So what ends up happening is, the event runs. It actually then hits that breakpoint. So this is where we want to kind of debug that event installer. The one thing I will say is after you've actually made sure that the install works very well, I would actually turn that off because you shouldn't actually go through that debug and attach each time. It actually slows down your overall debugging process, and I'll show you where that switch is. But basically what we end up doing is when we do the install, we actually get the client context for the SharePoint site that we're installing into. We also get the current user, current web. And then we determine the tenant that this user is on. So you see down here we were getting current user. Let me step through this. And then what we do is we actually initiate our own services. We'll talk a little bit more about how we're using our services set. But after we actually validate that there's a valid context for the user, then we call it create tenant. So we grab the current user, we grab the current realm that they're in, and then we actually call create user or create tenant. And what that does is actually does all of our initialization script for that tenant.
And some of the things here around, you see that we're capturing like the target principal name and realm. You guys may have never even seen that in the app model, but those are things that later on are going to allow us to do some advanced things around an app-only call. And we'll talk about what an app-only call is.
So when we do the current tenant, what we've got is a table that has all the scripts that we need to run for a given tenant to provision it. So what you can see is we're using the entity model, and we actually do a loop through that for all the SQL statements, and then we just plug that tenant in as a parameter to all the different SQL statements, and we load that up. So it made it very easy for us to add new objects and new data to our sets. And then every time we actually run a tenant on there, we can actually just provision that based on some default data or default settings that we wanted to do. For the demo data, we actually got a little more complex because we wanted to do some randomization of things as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But basically what we had to do was have the base amount of data and defaults run so that the application could load and run. So I'll go ahead and run this so you can kind of see that experience. It's actually attaching and running right now. Let me look into this. So the data that we actually have for the default data, let's trust that, is actually down here. And with this, what we do is you'll see these SQL statements that we're actually just looping through with our entity model, and we're actually replacing that tenant ID in there.
So there's kind of two concepts here with data. There's some core data that every tenant needs. So it might be some like general settings, like some priorities, things like that. Like all tenants need some priorities for their tickets. Then there's a concept of demo data, and what that is, we'll talk about that here in a moment, but it's kind of like a getting started wizard.
So here you can see those SQL statements right in the middle there. We're actually just replacing that tenant. Go ahead and switch back over. It's going to take a while to connect.
All right, so once we had tenant figured out, right, and again, we kind of decided to do the tenancy based upon like a tenant ID, primarily because auto-hosted apps already show a good pattern for provisioning database and website for each single tenant, actually every site where it gets installed. So we wanted a good example of another approach. Plus there was the cost thing. Since we're putting it in our Azure, we don't have unlimited resources there. Well, once we figured out tenancy, we really needed to think about trials. So this is something that's more for if you're going to deploy something to the store, and we wanted that to be a consideration here. I'll talk just really quickly about some of the things that you can do around the store. One of those is there's a utility in CSOM that allows you to get licensing information. Basically what this will tell you is if your user is a free user, a trial user, or a paid user. And then you can use that however you want within your application. You really have the flexibility to do whatever you want with that licensing information. So for instance, in a help desk, I might say, oh, you're a trial user. You are going to max out at 100 tickets. After 100 tickets, you can't create anymore. So again, you have the ability to use that logic however you want. The one thing I'll say is that it is both in CSOM and JSOM. So what that means is you can do licensing checks with JavaScript. I don't think that's the best of ideas. I could probably hack that really quickly, just by attaching a JavaScript debugger and putting different variables in there. So I would probably lean towards making a recommendation that you do most of your licensing checking server side. In fact, I've talked with a few MVPs that do a lot of things in the store, and they've said, for all these SharePoint hosted apps that we're putting out there, we don't even bother. If you want to go to the hassle of trying to hack this, little thing, then so be it. The next thing we wanted to think of, and this isn't just for trials, I think you should think about this with all your applications, is the concept of helping users get started. So a help desk, it's a pretty comprehensive solution. There's a lot of things in it. And so for someone that's setting up the help desk, so setting up the categories and the engineers, maybe the different SLA levels, that's something you want to try to guide them through. I think this isn't an apps for SharePoint thing. This is just building good software, right? I think you want to think about really guiding someone through the process. I like to use the term a lot called Disney Simple. I want to make it very easy for a user when they come in here to be able to use this. It shouldn't be rocket science. And so what you'll see is we built that into our solution, including the concept of when I go to pick things like engineers, we actually let you do things like pick your followers or the people that follow you. If you think about it, in SharePoint, by default, your team, if you have all the team stuff set up, like who reports to who, your direct team is going to be followers of you, or your people you follow. And so that kind of makes sense, right? An engineering team that works help desk tickets, it's probably all going to be within a group or maybe a couple groups. And so it made it a way for us to accelerate that process of putting together that team. The other thing that we wanted to think about, and I think this is valid for trials and possibly for internally from like if you want to go through and train people on a system, is we wanted to build in the concept of demo data. If you think about a help desk solution, it might take weeks for it to fill up and really have enough data to be useful, to report against and do things like that. Well, we didn't want people to have to wait for that in order to learn this and train on this. And so we built into the application the concept of I want demo data, and it goes and like Nathan was saying, it does some random things, and it says, okay, based on the engineers you picked, we're going to randomly create a bunch of tickets, assign it to those people, and allow those users to actually start kind of working through this. So again, we felt like this was a really critical part of the application for people to be able to do. So I could go and download a trial, and within a few seconds, I can have the entire application populated. We also thought this was pretty cool for like people at Microsoft that do demos all the time. They could reset demos and get a demo ready almost instantaneously. So let's take a look at what that looks like. 6. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and kick this off. I've already done the app install event, so it knows my tenant at this point in time. So it shouldn't take long for this to come up. But what it's going to do, it's going to stop me, and it's going to say, hey, I noticed that you're brand new around here. Would you like some help getting started? So this is kind of when we talk about the wizard, we wanted it immediately displayed to a new user of our system and really walk them through things. So I'll go ahead and say OK here to do some demo data. The first thing it's going to do is allow us to select some demo users. We'll talk a little bit about some of the security on like multiple pages in or views within our application. But here you can see where I can do things like pick people that I follow, use people that follow me, or I could pick specific people. So we actually did a lot of work in here around user interface, and we'll talk about that. So we did things like build, a full-on people picker. So if I wanted to go and pick specific individuals, I could go and add users this way, one by one. But we also gave the ability to do things a little bit faster, where I could go say, okay, you know what, I don't want these guys on my team, but I do want, I think that looks like a good set of groups. So we'll just do maybe 4 engineers. And I'll go ahead and say OK. Now, when I click OK here, it should take about 10 to 15 seconds. But behind the scenes, it's going to basically generate a ton of data in this system. So as soon as this finishes, my UI here will refresh, and I'm going to already have alerts. I'm going to have tickets. I'm going to have all this stuff built into the system to where I can immediately start working on it. So ultimately, before this, I had an empty database. I basically just had some core information that was in that.
Yeah, and one thing to point out too, Richard's tenant's actually in the cloud here. He's using Office 365. But if you've looked at how we actually do debugging on auto-hosted and provider-hosted apps, you'll notice on his URL it says localhost. So what ends up happening whenever we're doing debugging or development, you can actually run against your local IS instance and your local databases to really do any of the debugging development. You don't have to deploy that each time. So that's kind of one of the nice things about this new model is before you'd have to deploy all that to SharePoint each time. In this case, we're actually just doing it local. The other thing to point out too is we're making good use of social. So if you think about your applications and in scenarios where they might be doing some advanced collaboration scenarios, think about colleagues and associates with that person. So you can actually grab a lot of that stuff from SharePoint and leverage that in your applications as well. Same with search.
So you can already see, obviously, we use social during that wizard, but you could see other places where we're already pulling in social. So you can see it has my name, my title, and my picture from my SharePoint profile. So it's pulling all that information from the profile. I'll show you some other cool places where we're doing a lot around the profile. You can see that it's populated me already with a lot of information, but I'm going to go here to settings and show you some of this. So here you can see where I have my engineers, but if I wanted to add additional engineers, maybe I'll add Garth here to our list. So I'll go ahead and add Garth. Ticket categories, it pre-created a bunch of ticket categories, but I could change these. Maybe I don't want a security category, or maybe I want to change. We thought it would be cool to do things like color code all our categories, so an engineer can quickly go and see, well, you know what, I work all the networking tickets, and I can quickly find those networking tickets. So if I wanted to change maybe the facilities color, I can go pick a different color that I might want. So we made it very easy for people to do things like that. Another place where we have some rich integration with SharePoint is around taxonomy and social and search. So one of the things we can do is actually subscribe to certain hashtags that might allow us as engineers to identify issues with systems before they actually start popping up and we get a lot of tickets around those. So imagine if you're here at a conference. Almost every conference I go to, at some point, there's some sort of like networking challenges, like Wi-Fi dropping, things like that. Well, I could do things like, you know what, I want to subscribe to Wi-Fi. I want to subscribe to maybe SharePoint. So if someone has issues with SharePoint, maybe someone has issues with Link. We'll add a few more in here just so we get a nice list. We'll do Office, Windows 8.
And this is a scenario where you can use the metadata services. So if you think about tagging or classifying information in your application, metadata services is a good way to do that and actually have those keywords. You can actually manage that globally, and then you can actually leverage that in your applications or subsets of that in your applications through the app model.
The other thing we have here is SLAs. So we have 4 different ticket levels. We chose not to make that configurable, although actually the data model supports it. But our 4 levels are low, normal, high, and critical. And for each one of those, I can specify my own SLA value. And what will happen is if a ticket is open longer than the SLA, you'll start to see it turning red and blinking and things like that. So we make it very obvious for an end user that tickets have exceeded an SLA. Another thing that I'll point out on the screen here, I'm not going to do it yet, but I'll show you guys later, is imagine I did populate my app with a bunch of demo data, and all of a sudden I'm ready to do a new training, or maybe I'm ready to actually use it for real. I'm done with the trial. I actually want this app in our application. We did provide the ability to do a reset here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and kind of the concerns that we thought through thinking about clearing out a database of a user's data. There's some concerns that might be there. I'm going to go ahead and save this and show you why we did the hashtags here. So those are actual terms in a taxonomy term store. So it's a folksonomy, an open term set. But I'll go ahead and save here and go to, we have a really cool tab called Activity that engineers get. When I click on Activity, what it's going to do, it's going to go out and search for any mention of those keywords, and it actually does a sentiment analysis on it. So you can see it gives it a little sentiment score. So in this case, you can see here's a red sentiment, a negative 2.36, and it says, I just got a blue screen of death on my old PC that runs Vista. Does anyone know how I can get Windows 8? So as an engineer, I might use that and say, okay, let me go ahead and just be proactive and reach out to this guy and connect him with the right people to get a new image on his machine. So again, we thought it was a neat way to bring in search. So we're using search here, we're using social, and we're using those taxonomies. So it's, I think, a good example of kind of going through some of that.
Yeah, and I think also when you consider search, one of the things when I'm working with developers that are looking at building apps, when you think about getting data from multiple sites within the enterprise, in the app model, basically the permissions you have to keep stepping up a level. So you get current host, you can actually get from your site permission. But if you have to go across sites, think about search. Search reads are actually a great way to collect and aggregate information that's across the whole tenant or across the whole farm. And it's a good way to kind of classify that information as well.
So you want to do some alerts here
Sure.
and tickets?
Yeah, so the other thing that we had to do was just kind of basic adminning of creation of tickets and whatnot. So one of the things that we started out with alerts. So we've got alerts where we can actually do some basic closing and opening up of alerts. So I'll go ahead and create a new alert.
So the idea behind alert is if I'm getting a bunch of tickets on one issue, let me be able to create some alerts and make that available for like a wider audience to see. So I might be coming in as a user to create a ticket. And I can see, oh, they already know about the Wi-Fi issue. They're working on it. I don't even need to create a ticket. They're already in the process of working on it.
So basically, we can do that classification. So we go look at the settings that Richard set up. We've got the color coding on there. We'll go ahead and we've got network selected. We could do a description. We could do a location. And users affected, so we'll say 500. We also decided that on the creation of alerts that we would actually have certain types of categories that we would set things to, how many users based on, and we can actually make some determinations on impact of that. The other thing that we did was on creation of tickets. So we'll go ahead and create a new ticket. And what we tried to do was, one of the things that we find is when we're working with customers, a lot of times they actually create these very large forms where really most of it's not required. You can actually get a lot of it. So what we decided was, especially in SharePoint land, you look at the forms for uploading documents, and people actually get carried away with metadata. And although you want that metadata, you also want a very easy experience and try to get as much of that metadata as possible. So let's go ahead and create a new ticket as a user. So maybe I can't connect from my home to the corporate network, and we'll say that's a network issue. The corporate net, and we'll go ahead and hit OK. So once we create that very simple, two-button type of thing, easily something that they can do from, potentially another device, a phone or something else that we can quickly actually get the information that they need. And then when I actually click on that ticket, what you'll notice is we actually grab a lot more information. So we actually do the priority. We actually decide that everything's a normal priority coming in. If we asked the user what a priority of a ticket would be, it would always be probably high. So we didn't want it. We said, that's actually kind of useless. We created the ticket number, which made sense. We obviously initialized it unassigned, the created date. The SLA duration, so you see that duration in there. It's based on those SLA settings. And you'll notice over on the left side, there's a lot of those that are red. So we wanted to make some alerting of ticket priority and whatnot as well. The other thing that we did was we assigned the requester, so we didn't have to ask them again for their name. And then we also geocode it. In this case, we're actually in this convention here. We don't get location awareness. But if we did, we'd actually have the geocoding of where that ticket was actually opened at. So again, another example of, maybe we can actually assign the right people based on where they're at, but we don't have to ask them. We know where they're at. And especially if we've got geocoding or location awareness on our network or our browsers. One thing to be aware of, though, is if you do kind of rely on it not working on every network as well. So either have a fallback plan or don't make it a requirement, to have that set. So definitely tested it on both. The other thing that we wanted to do was actually have something more with social. So you see on here I've got comments where I can actually have a discussion about this ticket, any notes that I might post on here. Maybe, did you try rebooting, right? That's a popular one. So you'll notice that we can actually have these different note board posts actually go to their feed each time as well. And maybe what we want to do is only have certain events actually post on their wall feed. In this case, we actually just post that the ticket closed event goes onto their news feed or their wall feed, so they know what their current status of the ticket is without having to jump into the application. And just to kind of show you a couple other ones. So you see that's all me. You see on here we've got a couple of ones that were actually geocoded to different locations. And then we actually have the conversation of where we got assigned, people got assigned to, and then maybe any conversation that we've had with those people on there as well. Okay.
Why don't you change a priority and maybe reassign this to someone else?
So we'll make that a critical, and we'll go ahead and assign that to me. So again, we're using that people picker again. And we can actually query SharePoint, grab that, and then we'll go ahead and save this as well. If I navigate away from this also prompts me to do the saves on that.
Cool.
So one of the other things that we did was on the databases itself, we decided we're personally big fans of entity model. I'm not a big fan of writing a lot of the SQL unless I have to. Entity model works really well. There are situations where on the entity model we decide to execute SQL statements, especially when we had to do a lot of the randomization, where we just needed some logic to kind of create those SQL statements and execute them, and the entity model wasn't the best fit, but we could still use entity model to execute kind of through that. The other thing that we decided to do was we wanted to use Azure because of the way we were going to expose this app and publish it. So be aware when you're using SQL Azure, if you want to do Azure websites and leverage SQL Azure, if you're using SQL 2012 locally, it's not 100% compatible with SQL Azure. It's about 99%. but I did notice there was a couple other changes. So you definitely want to, in your process of development, go against maybe a SQL Azure database. In our case, I actually just started using SQL Azure database as my main development instead of local DB as well, just because I didn't want to deal with any of the changes as I was publishing and doing QA and testing during the cycle. The other thing that we wanted to do was we decided to use REST kind of across the board in this architecture. So we actually use REST, we use gets and posts, and we did that because we were calling the SharePoint services that way. We were also exposing and publishing our services that way. So we can kind of keep one fluid pattern for that level of the UI and have kind of the JSON and REST services kind of query across both SharePoint and our own data services. And we just found it was a very easy way to actually have kind of a rich client integration piece.
One thing I'll point out there on the REST services is you see that all services perform a tenant check. We felt that was really important. Interestingly, you can try to hack away at the application all you want. You'll never find the concept of a tenant ID. The tenant ID is something that's completely transparent to the user. It's something that we only have server side. But every single call they make, we apply that tenant ID. We didn't want someone to be able to try to hack in and put a different tenant ID and end up creating tickets on a different, in a different portion of the database that's not there. So that was a really important thing here around hardening services. We did a lot of work around hardening those services. Actually, I think we have another slide about some of that, so I'll hold off. So the next thing we wanted to talk about was UI and branding. So the first thing I'll talk about here is some of the JavaScript libraries. When we presented this before, I get asked what sort of libraries did you guys use. The only thing we really used that was open source was jQuery, and we did use a special library for some of our visuals that you guys haven't seen yet. Some of the reporting we'll talk about. I chose to break up our JavaScript files into basically 4 areas. So we have a common one that basically is reused across all the different, it's kind of utilities. In fact, that may have been a better name for it, would be utils. We have a data one where we've basically wrapped up all of our REST calls that we make. We have a UI that is more for UI specific things like controls, like you notice that we do a people picker quite a bit, things like that. And then we did a UI templates. This is somewhere where maybe Knockout would have maybe fit in, but we tried to minimize the amount of open source because it slows down the legal process here at Microsoft. The next thing is Chrome control versus brand. And this is an area that Nathan and I probably beat our heads against for a long, long time. We actually redid the UI of this completely 3 times. We first did it, and we made it look very much like Azure. I saw a few snickers with my little green spinner because it looks very much like the blue spinner in Azure. And then we were like, no, this looks too much like Azure and the Azure portal. And then we said, let's use the Chrome control. And we built it all using the Chrome control. And then we kind of stopped and said, for something that's like a significant application that has a brand, I think it's okay not to use the Chrome control. It doesn't have to look like the SharePoint site that you're coming from. And that's where we ended up. So you could see that we obviously kind of came up with our own brand for this. And that's kind of where we decided we wanted to go. Again, we went through several iterations before landing on this. I would say if you do your own brand and you forget the Chrome control, one really important thing, you need to provide a link back to the host web. So you can see up there at the top, we put a little Office 365 link. If it was an on-prem version of the app, we'd probably say SharePoint or something like that. But you really do give them a place to get back to where they came from. The next thing is, we had an MVP that did kind of a first stab at building help desk. And it was cool. He built kind of the SharePoint component, and he built a Windows Phone app version of it. And I thought that was really cool that he did that, but at the same time, I realized that not everyone has Windows phones. There's iPhones, there's Androids. And so we wanted to take a completely different approach. We decided that let's just build our UI in a responsive way so that any device can pull it up. And that's kind of the approach we took. So, I'm not going to give you a big lecture on building responsive web, but a few things that we did is obviously we had a lot of use of using ULs. So all of our things are in ULs, all of kind of our components within the application. We also made very, very strategic use of a 320 width. So 320 hits most of the major mobile browsers these days. So you notice that most of the elements are about 320 pixels wide. My side navigation over there where I can click on different tickets, the different UI elements where I see the different specifics about the ticket. Almost everywhere you go in our app, we tried to be very consistent so it was easy. I didn't want to have to resize everything. I wanted it to kind of just be able to collapse on itself and still look good. And I'll show you some examples of that here in a moment. Even our modal dialogue. So we built several modal dialogues. It's all in that UI framework that we came up with. All of those are 320 pixels, so I don't have to do anything special. It just automatically resizes to kind of what we decided was, let's pick our minimum width and let's kind of make things work around that. And I think it worked out well for us. We also did a lot around trying to make things touch-friendly. If you think about if I am on a mobile device, the thing that annoys me to no end is if I'm on a touch device and I have fly-out menus that have hovers, that just doesn't work, right? I mean, you don't have a mouse to hover. You have a finger that's touching a screen. And so we were really cognizant about that and tried to do things like make big buttons. You can see I have a big button panel. We also wanted to make it to where, since it is very client-side, hopefully you've noticed that the application is very client-side, we tried to make it to where we're not always saving. We actually cache a lot of the things up. So if someone accidentally tries to navigate away, we do block them. What happens is anytime they change something, we basically set a dirty flag, and then we prompt them to do the saves. So we do kind of one save at a time, so we're not constantly doing a number of service calls that might wear out a battery on a mobile device. The other thing is, you haven't seen it yet. We'll show it to you in a second, but although this is a full screen app for those that kind of learned the different shapes of apps for SharePoint, we thought it was very important to be able to take components of the application and dovetail those into other areas. So imagine if you're in charge of IT for your organization, you might have a help desk app, but maybe when someone comes to your IT site on the intranet, on your portal, you can still show the alerts there. So, or maybe the tickets for that user. And that's what we tried to do here is we still did things like developed app parts so that users could, without ever having to go into the application, just by visiting the website in SharePoint, be able to see some of that data. And so that was an important thing that we decided to do in here.
So when we looked at some of the things that we'll show you from a security standpoint is we wanted to use Rust, but a lot of the questions that we were always getting before we built this one was, okay, that's great if you're actually, when you're authenticating on the app itself, but what if we actually expose Rust services? How would you actually handle the authentication on that side? So we'll show you kind of how we actually decided to do that. But basically, it comes down to we always had to make sure that any call to the service always has to do an authentication check to make sure that there's a valid tenant that was already authenticated for that given session or that given user. So we went ahead and did that. The other thing that we did was we needed to do some role checks. So there's a couple different ways that you can do role-level security, but at the time frame that we kind of built this, role-level security for a lot of applications are actually going to be, if they're low-level or low-trust applications, basically OAuth to the SharePoint application, tend to use SQL roles for that type of thing. So basically roles in a database that we do lookups on. We've got newer ways to do that now, especially if you're on-premise, you obviously could do a high-trust app and use Windows Identity. You could also use a claims-based as kind of a secondary trust level as well. And then finally, if you're actually doing cloud apps now, we released the Azure AD stuff. And if you do need to do more of a Windows Identity or group level type trust, you could actually use Azure AD as a secondary trust source and then query AD groups and whatnot if you need to do that as well. Finally, what we did was we wanted to use kind of People Picker and have that experience for selecting users. And then, like Richard mentioned, is we really want to be careful about how we're doing postbacks on the different systems.
Yeah, so some of the big things that have a big impact on that tenant, we weren't going to expose those as REST services, right? Even though we're authenticating, we're doing all those things. So think about doing a reset of the application. You're basically purging all that data. I am not going to be in the business of making that something that's REST enabled, I think. Even with our hardening, we wanted to make sure we didn't do that. And so you'll see that some of those do a post. That's one of the only things that does a post back in the system. So show you a few other things in the application. We'll go back over here. So here be an example of using the app part. So you can see I'm just on a SharePoint site here, but I can still see, here's my app part that lists all my different tickets. The cool thing about the app parts, they can actually resize themselves. Even though this is an iframe, as I add more alerts, I can actually go and tell my parent, go tell the host site that I need more room. And it'll actually resize itself. So we do that through what we call post message API. So I think that's kind of a neat thing about these app parts, and keep that in mind as they can resize themselves for something like this that ultimately could continue to add more and more alerts.
Yeah, and also on the app part, we had a lot of discussion and kind of debate on the app parts themselves probably do need to follow the branding of the site more than the kind of branding of the app. What you don't want to have is a bunch of app parts that look like they're actually individually a bunch of apps running. You know, you really want to have the app parts to be able to live on a site and actually take on the styles of the site itself. So you notice that we just ended up agreeing that let's just put a little banner so we got some of our branding, but actually take on the styles of that site.
Yeah, so this is actually uses the exact same styles as a normal SharePoint list view. The next thing I'll show you guys is some of the different roles. So I'm actually logged in as a different user who's just a normal employee. They're not an engineer. So you can see Robin Counts here. If I go into the help desk application, what you'll see is she has a much different view of the world than an engineer has. So hopefully if we get in here, she's just going to have basically 4 things. She can look at alerts. She can look at her tickets. She can look at the history of tickets she's had in the past, or she can look at some statistics about kind of how we're doing as an organization in closing help desk tickets. Not a lot of things that are there compared to if I go to my engineer's view. You can see that the engineer has a ton of different things. They have a queue that they, is the tickets they're working on. Lots of different views that they can go and look at. The next thing I'll show you is responsive web. So I'll just grab I'm going to dock one here to the side, and I need to refresh it because it's old. But what you'll see here is that we basically just kind of make things restack to fit the screen. So you can see here everything still fits within the screen. If I wanted to go check out tickets, I can see tickets, I can create tickets. All of this works within that smaller scale. So that's something that's going to fit on that mobile device and be useful. Yeah, was there a question? I think it goes back.
Yeah, with the post-message API.
So post-message API, it'll go back to 8, I believe, IE 8. Yeah, it's not. I believe it does. You know what? If you want to afterwards, I'll put it in compatibility mode and change it to IE 8 mode, and we'll see. But I believe it goes back to IE 8. So that's some of the responsive web. I think you guys have seen some of the things we did around setting kind of that dirty flag. So if I come in here to work a ticket and change something, like I'll sign this to maybe Garth or Garrett, that if I try to navigate away, it's going to say, do you want to discard your changes? So that's some of the things that we did around that. So I can go ahead and say no, and I can click save and be able to kind of move off from that. See what else I wanted to show there. Engineer versus, let's do the reset. All right. So if I go here to settings, and again, even though this is going to do a post back, again, think about what I'm doing here. I'm basically about to purge this entire tenant. So we are going to provide that second level of, are you really sure you want to do this? So you can see that we're giving them that second prompt. But once I say OK here, what you'll see is that it will actually go and it's going to process that behind the scenes. And then it starts me right back where I was, right? So I can now go through the whole process again of either going through the demo wizard or starting fresh and being able to do that kind of on my own.
And one thing to note on the whole reset, the reason why we had to put that in there was when we add an app event on install to actually add data, think about what you want to do when you remove that application. So the app gets installed into a site. If you add anything to that or provision anything for that, are you going to unprovision that when you uninstall it? What if an admin just uninstalled it accidentally? Maybe we want to keep that stuff around. So that's what we decided to do. Was what we don't want to do is actually have it on 3 different sites, and then maybe they remove it on one location, and it actually removes the tenant or removes the data. So you got to be really careful about how do you want to have that state removed or cleaned up. And with us not wanting to do it on an uninstall event, our option really is to actually do something within the application itself, within maybe an admin flag type of scenario as well.
I'll show some of this.
So one of the things that I kind of wanted to point out on the entity model, and then we'll jump into kind of the services and how we're returning that. If you look at basically our entity model, it actually started fairly small, as probably most projects do. We had started with kind of 3, 4 tables. We thought, oh, that's probably all we need is like 3 tables, 4 tables, settings and tickets, and then certainly we need a tenant. And then we started going, well, we kind of need roles. We kind of need categories, product priority. We actually started all those as settings. We thought, well, we could actually do settings and name value pairs for each of these things. But then as we started having scope creep in our application, we started going, well, it'd really be kind of nice if we had these other things off of priorities, like SLAs and the icons and things like that. So all of a sudden, we had to start breaking that stuff out. And then we decided that that should be fine. I mean, let's make it a clean data model, and a clean entity model is more important than having this really obscure thing that's just renaming everything every time we're calling it. So anyway, so we start with the entity model. The other thing that we wanted to do was, because we're using the JSON calls and the REST calls on this, what we wanted to do is basically have complete control over how it serializes. So we actually implement our data contracts in there as well. So for each of these guys, our data contracts were pretty straightforward for the most part, but we also wanted to have kind of some composite contracts as well. So for example, ticket, we actually wanted to grab multiple things and actually add it to a ticket, so that when we did a dump of a ticket, we actually had all the relationships and just flattened it for our purposes, for reports, as well as for just any of our UI controls as well. So really, when you're looking at kind of giving front-end control in the entity model, a lot of times it makes sense to maybe have your own data contracts that are actually serializing and pushing that stuff to the front-end JavaScript UI.
So for those of y'all that have worked with the entity framework, who's more of like a database first guy? Like to do database first? Who'd like to do entities first? Okay, yeah. So it's half a dozen one way, half a dozen the other. We decided in this case entities first because of how we were going to use REST.
So the other thing that we had to do is, Richard was mentioning, we have a lot of internal calls where if the pages themselves or the service itself was actually making a call that needed to say, hey, here, I know the tenant already, or I know the realm that this is in. What is that tenant going to be? So we wanted to make those all internal. So basically, whenever a user was calling or a client was calling, we would actually just call the method itself. And then internally, what we would do is call getTenant. So you see on here, there's an internal method for getTenant. And then what we do is basically do that entity query, and then we do the selection into our tenant data contract, and then pass that to back to the calling method. But you'll notice that each of our calls themselves, let me grab a public one, are actually just a, let me grab a different one, are just basically a public method here we go, that actually do the entity model passing back to that data contract. But you'll notice that we never actually pass in anything other than, we never pass the tenant back into it. We basically just generate all that on our getTenant methods. So getTenant, in this case, we are actually doing a getTenant from an email. And the other ones, we're actually doing getTenant based on our utility classes that we've got.
Yeah, that was a good example.
So here you go. So notice that second line we're doing is authenticated. So every call is basically checking to see if it's a valid authenticated service call. Go ahead.
Is that code, you said that code is generated?
No, so yeah, the entity model is our data contract. We actually took and actually modified it and actually created our own data contracts for that. So the entity model obviously is generated. The data contract, we actually took that and actually made some modifications for the contracts that we were sending to the front end. As far as this stuff, so obviously this stuff was actually the service methods are what we created. So you notice on here we've got the web invoke. We're doing a post on this. The default for the web methods are actually using JSON, so we can actually take the default parameters for anything that's not a post. But again, what we're doing is authenticated call. And getTenant, so that if someone actually sees this service out here, they can't just call it with anything. We know which paths they've come in. They've either come in from our application or from one of our Excel or our email app, or authenticated via the email service itself.
All right.
So next, what we're going to look at is our mail apps. So in our project, What we really wanted to do was we have the web parts, but the web parts are useful in scenarios where you're going to the portal. But in a lot of our scenarios, in a lot of our customer scenarios, people are in email all day. And I know for myself, especially when I look at like this event, I keep them searching for the email that has the links to the information that I need to get to. And then you also have to look at what's the current information. So what we wanted to do was basically create some mail apps that jumped into the different types of popular scenarios. So maybe current ticket status, and we actually have a survey one as well, so that we can actually maybe on closeout of a ticket, we can actually survey that user and collect survey information without them having to jump to our portal and provide information there. So on the project structure, again, we wanted to basically keep everything in the central website itself and just have the web apps as basically the markup language or the manifest that we actually deploy to our Exchange servers. The calls that we make in the SharePoint side, if we actually need to make a SharePoint call in the Mail app, we actually make what's called an app-only call. So in SharePoint, in this new app model, you can actually make app-only calls. So if you want to do something, you basically give the app the permission to make the SharePoint call so that the user's not having to have that permission level to make that call. So kind of an escalated call in some cases.
Yeah, and that makes sense if you think about it. If I'm in OA here, I never was in SharePoint, right? So how do I get context in a normal way? And so that was a pretty critical part to do some of this.
So one of the things that we did was we wanted to reuse a lot of the development UI work that we did. So we basically created a separate view on top of the get ticket status, so that get ticket status, so we can actually have a filtered view on that and just reuse that in our app. The one thing I will tell you is after building several mail apps, when you're building the mail apps, and especially if you're doing a lot of iterations on a line of business system, I highly recommend that you build the actual line of business logic and UI first before you actually add it to a mail app. I mean, understand your constraints of a mail app, which is the sizing of it and the width, the no scroll bars that you want to use. So we've got some guidance on the different limitations that you want to put on the mail app as far as the UI goes. But really, after you do that, really build out that page logic itself before having to do the whole deployment to Exchange. Because on the mail app, when you do a debug, it actually does that deployment and then log into Exchange each time you're going to deploy and test and debug that mail app. You could go a lot faster if you just do the web page and then make it a mail app at kind of the end of it.
Show us.
So I'm going to go back I'm in my tenant. I'm going to go into my Outlook in our tenant. The mail apps will work also in the rich client. They also work in the web apps, the OA mail app as well. So again, whenever we close out a ticket, a mail gets sent, and then the mail apps did anyone go to the office session? Or has anyone built a mail app before? Okay, the mail apps actually work on an activation. So there's a rules-based activation. Whenever we get an email in, we can detect on the status or the person that sent that email, or we can do it on the subject of that email. And we have a rules activation. So if maybe it was sent by the help desk, we could actually say these are the apps that need to be on the app bar. If it's a certain status, we can actually, or subject, we can also queue up mail apps as well that way. So kind of one of the ones that you've got in here, so we've got the ticket status from that ticket that I opened up. I can't connect from my home from a corporate network. The help desk ticket actually sent out that email. But I don't have to go look for that latest email on that status. Real time, I can actually now query our system and our web services and actually get the real-time information through our mail app. It's very nice. It actually just comes up there, and we can kind of close that. The other thing that we do is we actually have one for a survey as well. Let me actually find a survey in here. Here's a survey. So on the survey, whenever we close a ticket, we want to actually survey them. So what I can actually do is have take survey. The one thing that I noted on the take survey side is we really are limited to the type of postback you can do via the mail app. For security reasons, we want to have kind of just really gets of our service. So that's what I'm actually doing on this, is basically get with parameters on the REST calls to actually do that send back of the data. So I actually have kind of the next button. How did you contact the help desk? We probably would know this in reality, but we'll go ahead and collect that information because maybe the group that's measuring this doesn't know that. How many days did it take to resolve? We'll say 3 to 5. And also you want to look at perception as well. What was the experience like? We'll say it was a 4. And then we could also do additional comments. What else would you like to do as a feedback too?
Actually, it's interesting that the survey part of this is kind of an entire app in itself. Nathan built it where it was really flexible to where you could configure your own questions. We just haven't built a
management for the questions. What we decided to do, I was like, well, if I'm going to actually create the questions and the answers, and then kind of the navigation through the survey, surveys are actually pretty good for corporate communications as well, or maybe benefit enrollments or other types. It didn't have to be limited to kind of help desk. So we decided to build kind of a full survey engine in our entity model as well, and then have that kind of loaded based on any kind of survey that you want to send out. It really is looking up, for this tenant, for this subject area, what survey is valid for them. And I actually do that by checking the survey in the subject bar itself, and then actually doing a query based on what survey and what questions for that tenant and that survey ID that I've got. Okay.
Cool. All right. The next thing is we wanted to, again, looking at the holistic solution and really leveraging the breadth of the new app model, is we wanted to bring Excel in here as well. And actually, one of the main reasons is, as we looked at what other help desk solutions did for reporting, we found that we couldn't tackle all scenarios for reporting, right? So we actually have reporting against tickets, engineers, maybe even survey responses. But we wanted to make it a little bit more simple to where let's just find a way at getting the raw data in Excel, because Excel's kind of Microsoft's answer for BI. You notice that all our investments for BI are really going in Excel, whether it's the brand new stuff like GeoFlow, Power View, Power Pivot, it's all in Excel. So if we could get the raw data into Excel, we can then use it any way we want. So a few of the challenges we had here was, well, one, since we have this database that has multiple tenants in it, I could have competitors theoretically in the same database. I need a way in my Excel app to be able to get the right tenant's data. And we actually thought through this time over and over and over. And what we ultimately landed on is that if we actually put the Excel app and host it from the app web in SharePoint, when I look, there's actually an API here that's office.context.document.url. That's basically telling us where the item came from. I basically can get the tenant information that I need. So we actually look at the location that the document came from in order to determine who the tenant is. So I think that's a really important thing around tenancy. And that's really the only contextual thing that you're going to have available to you without providing like a login screen in the app, which we certainly didn't want to do. The other thing from getting just raw data, we decided to come up with a way to take just JSON data and convert it to an Office table. So you can see over there in the left side of the screen that we just bring the raw data in, and then you can do with it as you like. So let's take a look at what this looks like in the solution. So we did put some statistics inside of the application. So if I go to statistics, we have a couple of, and this is available to everyone, even normal users. They can go look at just some general statistics. For the last 7 days, what has been the tickets created and the tickets closed? So you can see I have a demo environment, so it doesn't look very realistic. But we can also look for a lifetime, what days get the most tickets created. And I can almost bet you the reason Wednesday has a big spike here is because I probably went through that demo wizard and I created a whole bunch of tickets on that one day because I used that demo wizard. But again, the idea is let's provide just kind of some high-level information that's helpful for everyone. But if I want to go further, I can click the Analyze in Excel. And what's going to happen is I'm going to ultimately get Excel with my app loaded in it. And then we give them a few different things. I can go get ticket reports, or I could do survey results. In this case, I'll go and maybe grab we'll grab June's tickets. And I'll do tickets by category. At this point, I can close my app. I really just used it to get raw data. And I can start using normal Excel things to report against. So if I wanted to look at maybe category by the number of tickets closed, I can even do things like come over here and say, show me some recommended charts. You know what, I like that one. Let's go ahead and insert that into our page. So you could see by doing the raw data, I really open it up to where I don't have to think about every scenario that a user would want to report against. they can ultimately just use it as a data source, and we can let them create their reports off of in the ways they want.
And one of the interesting things, too, is on the drop-down, basically what we decided to do, and I just had a hatred for ad hoc reporting and the kind of the request of kind of endless reports, so I always kind of like to have a very flexible model for doing ad hoc reporting so that they can kind of go and do whatever they want. But that drop-down, basically, each of that drop-down is actually just a JSON method call. So we have a friendly name and then the JSON method call name, and it's going through our generic formatter. So we can actually create new views very quickly and have it go through our generic formatter to actually use those Excel tables in any type of report. So as we were adding the surveys to it, we were like, well, we've already got something. We can actually just add surveys to this and just create new methods and put those in the drop-downs.
All right, so we're coming to almost to a conclusion. I wanted to give you guys a few additional tips and tricks that we couldn't think of, like the right place for it to go in the application, or I'm sorry, the presentation. So one of my tips is consider the scenario when the user tries to navigate directly to your app. It's quite frequent that, hey, they find the help desk, they go and save it as a favorite. Well, the problem is if they go to that directly, the token helper, all the things behind the scenes that give you context, it's going to be like, well, I don't have context. I didn't come from SharePoint, because SharePoint actually posts all the contextual information to the app. So what you need to do is you need to think about that and say, I don't have context. The good thing is that there is a layouts page called the app redirect page that I can go and send them to really quickly, and it'll bring me back to my app with context. And actually, I'll show you that here really quickly, what that looks like. I'll close all of my browsers. I'll bring up a browser here, and I believe I have a favorite to it somewhere. Thought I saved it as a favorite. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll go into this one. I have a Kudos one. This is a different application, but I try to build this into all my applications. Actually, I've come up with kind of creating our context util is doing weird things. So think about that when you're doing your applications, that you might want to look for context and redirect to be able to get it. Think about authentication to other areas you might leverage. So there's some quirky things with different browsers when it comes to different zones and when I've been authenticated. So think about when I go to the My Site. If I've never been to my site and I've never authenticated into the My Site, bringing up like a profile picture, it's going to stop, because behind the scenes, if you look at Fiddler, it actually goes and tries to log you into that My Site. So think about that within your application. What we've done is we've provided kind of training guidance for anyone that downloads the app. Hey, you need to do this. You need to make sure that you put this, if one's in trusted sites, the other one needs to be trusted sites so that they're in the same zone and they can share cookies. That's the key. The other thing I would say is that keep hackers in mind when you're delivering a predominantly client-driven UI. This isn't a SharePoint thing. Again, it's just an app thing. I think if you are a SharePoint developer, you're probably more new to this world of jQuery and doing things client-side than probably other web developers are. So now that we are kind of in that age, we need to get with the times and make sure that we're hardening things that are done client-side. It gives a great experience, but we need to make sure that those are solid.
Yeah, and as far as my side goes, really a couple things that we really kind of learned through this. We didn't do a ton of multi-tenant apps before, so what we realized was if you're testing and debugging and developing a multi-tenant app, always have 2 tenants in there, kind of on your dev test staging, because we noticed a lot of our bugs, actually I would say probably 70% of our bugs were because of we tested everything works fine with one app, but that we missed a filter, or we missed, we returned multiple result sets because we didn't have everything kind of quite filtered correctly. The other thing was publishing is a big deal, especially when you're looking at provider hosted. So you definitely want to run local and get the debugging going. But I would say the first time that you have a web form, and maybe the first time you do a web form and a database connection with display results, go ahead and publish that to whatever place that you're going to plan on publishing. If you're doing it in Azure, it's a very easy thing to actually do the publishing profiles and actually have that publishing set up. Because what you don't want to do is in that last week or that last couple of months, be the first time you're publishing. There's some client IDs, client secrets you have to have in sync. There's also, any compatibility issues from local DB to, like I said, in my case, the Azure DB. So definitely publish it. And what I've noticed is When you publish early on, you're much more likely to actually release more revs of it to a QA group. If you don't publish early on, you tend to hold on to stuff longer and do less cycles to a QA or acceptance team. So definitely publish that kind of early on.
All right, so we're kind of coming to an end. These were our session objectives. We wanted to discuss some of the complex challenges of kind of a tenancy-aware cloud-hosted app. We wanted to demonstrate some of the patterns and practices for the new app model and show some solutions and kind of look how we can use the full breadth of the new app model in a solution. And I hope we achieved that with you guys. And if we did, I really would appreciate some positive feedback through evaluations. At this point, I would open it up for questions if you guys have those. Remember, we actually have some prizes if we get good questions. So we'll wait at the end and maybe pick a good.
Yeah, good question. So we optimistically thought it would take, what would you say, 3 weeks we were thinking? We were actually thinking we'd take us a couple weeks to do it kind of nights and weekends. It wasn't our full-time job to develop this, probably as most of you guys, when you're looking at, you have your support jobs, you have user jobs, BA stuff. It probably took us to do everything
2 months.
2 months of nights and weekends. My wife really liked it. She liked that. She was very unimpressed when I showed her the app and the time I spent away from her and the family to build this. But she did get to come to Spain to talk about it as well.
Yeah, and I would say that we were really bad about scope creep too.
Yeah.
Like we didn't start with specific requirements other than we wanted to show the breadth of the app model, and we wanted to do like really kind of advanced patterns around tenancy and things like that. But along the way, it was like, oh, hey, it'd be cool if we had colors to our categories.
That's right.
And,
Let's do sentiment analysis on feedback.
Yes, sentiment.
Yeah. Yep.
How do we handle the tabs in the UI? So behind the scenes, I could probably find it in code, but ultimately we create server side because we don't want someone to be able to hack if they're not an engineer and get to like engineering things. But behind the scenes, we check a role and I generate a client side array ultimately of what tabs should be available to them.
There's the code for it. You go to that bind.
Yeah, so it's a client. It ends up being a JavaScript array, but it's one of those things where I generate it with server-side code. And every tab has a view. So all behind the scenes, when the page is first rendered, everything's there that the user has available to see, and we're just toggling different divs basically. Every button that you saw in the top navigation had a div associated with it. We actually used the data dash kind of model for it, so jQuery could find it really quickly.
Yeah, and that's where so all that formatting we did in our helpdesk.ui set, and then our helpdesk.data set was actually doing calls to our data services, and then actually just doing a callback to the help.ui set that actually formatted it on the page itself.
The other question I have is in terms of when you show when you were surfacing the ticket information in another SharePoint screen, and the idea is to use the avoid scroll bars wherever possible.
Yeah.
That's around paging. You've got a lot of data when you cache
Yeah.
data. How do you handle paging? Patterns around that.
So the pattern I would say that around paging is, I would certainly encourage that. I actually don't think we have paging in ours.
Yeah.
We just let it grow forever just because we're like, man, if you have 40 alerts in your organization, you have bigger problems, my friend. Right, exactly.
That's right. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
So what I would say there is that whatever you're doing to go to the next page, you need to call that resize again, because otherwise it's going to still take up all that space. It's really easy to call. I have examples of it on my blog because it's not the most widely documented thing out there, but it is documented in.
How big you've got to resize that panel based on the text that might be in the.
Yeah.
That's a bit tricky, isn't it?
It is, especially because you notice one of my big pet peeves with kind of the new app model is what I call style toggles. So, you may have seen it because this one did, but I actually think you should hide your UI until all the styles are there. And the problem is a lot of people are building these apps right now where it should pull in the apps from the host web, but because that might take a while, you see this ugly style and then all of a sudden it toggles and it looks pretty again. So you got to think of that too, right, when you do your resizing, because jQuery actually does a good job of getting me the pixels that I need to resize by, but if it changes, then after I've already sent the call to resize, then it's kind of fruitless, I guess, in that case. That's a really good point.
Yeah, you might have said it, but how did you determine the tendency in the mail app?
Oh, in the mail app? Yeah, so there's a couple different ways that you can determine it. Probably the most appropriate way would be in the mail app itself, in the mail app model, there's actually a service registration. And that's probably the proper way to do it, is basically bind that email to the actual service. And Exchange actually gives the SSO token. So that's really the way that you'd want to do it for kind of real secured information. Because in our mail app, we actually we're doing lookups on the tenant anyway. We actually just did it based on email domain of current logged in user for the mail app itself. You can get the current user of the mail and actually determine it that way. So what we ended up doing was we had a secondary method that ended up just looking at that email that was coming in, and then what we determined the tenant based off the email. It's not fail-proof to do it that way, because if I had multiple domains parked to that, so the right way to do it would be using the SSO token in the mail app APIs.
Yeah, I think another interesting thing about tenancy is, for those that have been watching this and thinking, oh, you're just doing things that are like store ready, and I mean, the concept of tenancy is not just a public thing, right? You could have I work with customers all the time that need to like isolate tenants within an organization. So this is just, these models I think are just as valid in an on-prem deployment for an app that you're building with no interest of ever going to a store. So it would certainly change that model when you got to that. So it might be completely different.
Yeah. Any other question?
How do you handle the SharePoint context if you bind the application to different site collections?
That's a great question, right? Because so for like an auto-hosted scenario, every site collection, or actually every sub-site that installs the app, gets its own version, its own database. For this, we felt like, and this was just the decision we made, is that an organization, unless you're like isolated by different like maybe business units, usually there's going to be one help desk, right? And I might have different engineers that work different types of tickets, but what we decided is every site collection, I can install this 50 times, but we're looking at the root domain, and so everyone in that web application is going to share the same database. So it's still the same help desk. And that's actually, we were cognizant about that. We wanted it that way. You could change it. You could say, let me look at the full path and give every path a different tenant. But we actually do it by the root domain and give everyone basically the same tenant from that.
So I think we're at time. If you guys have other questions, we are definitely can be hanging around here and answering any other questions, but we want to be respectful of the next group that's coming in here as well.
Yep. And I'll be at the office booth downstairs. So.
Yep.